Alright folks, so I posted a video a few weeks back talking about nature, extreme poverty, and also on why people living in poor regions around the world, why they completely trashed their communities. And that video caused a very heated argument online. I want to follow up on that video. So in this video, I want to focus on just one country, Nigeria, with a population of 232 million, and that population is exploding. And let's go through some of these numbers. Now, I have nothing against Nigeria. I have nothing against the ethnic Nigerians. I don't have a problem with your history and culture. But I'm going to talk about your future existential crisis that is looming over the country of Nigeria, and why it is so important to protect nature, to protect our environment. I certainly don't support the narrative of the mainstream media, but here's what I do want to focus on. So let's look at some raw numbers quickly. So Nigeria, Africa, is the most populous nation, population of 232 million. And the GDP as of 2024 is 1.44 trillion USD. You think that's pretty solid, but you have to consider the fact that that Nigeria has over 200 million people. So the GDP per capita is only about 152nd in the world. Something that's worth noticing is that I did mention the population collapse, but of course the world population is not decreasing, it's still increasing. Well, and there's also a direct correlation. Generally speaking, if you look at some of the poorest regions around the world, generally the people who are poor, they're more likely to have children, and there could be many contributing factors to this. And by the way, this is not a racial thing. I'm not talking about, oh, black people are poor, so they're more likely to have children. Let's compare two countries with roughly the same population, right? Compare Japan to the Philippines. If you look at the fertility rate and the births in the Philippines, it's more than double versus Japan. And Filipinos and Japanese, they're both ethnic Asians, right? So this is a culture thing, generally speaking, worldwide. And if the area has a lot of poverty, that means that women are more likely to have children. And but that's not the main focus of this video. So the fertility rate for Nigeria, it's 5.1. It's important to mention, right? The replacement rate is 2.11. And just to give you guys some kind of context, right now in Canada, the fertility rate is just 1.26, and which is also the same for Japan. It's also at 1.26. For China, it's 1.06. For Taiwan, it's 0.87. And for South Korea, which has the lowest birth rate in the world, it's at 0.68. So there's a very drastic contrast here. And also, 1 out of 5 newborns worldwide are Nigerian. That is very, very significant. So there's a population explosion. So the United Nations have predicted that Nigeria could actually surpass the United States one day, possibly by 2050, and their population could eclipse 400 million by 2050. So as you guys can see, right, this is a country that's going through a massive population explosion. But here's the thing, if your country is going through a population explosion, how are you going to come up with the resources to support the increasing population? This is going to cause all kinds of issues. Now, the most profitable industry in the country of Nigeria is the oil and gas industry. So this generates roughly, there's no exact number, roughly 25% of their GDP. So Nigeria has a very, very rich oil reserve. And so the country has been drilling their crude oil for the past 50 years. And it's estimated that they still have roughly 50 years left. Or do they really have 50 years left? Because the country is dying. You're going through a population explosion, and the resources, the arable land and the water all across Nigeria is dying. If you're watching this from Nigeria, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So most of that, the 25% of Nigeria's GDP is actually illegal. Okay, this might be controversial. So many of the poor Nigerians who basically don't have a choice, they don't have a lot of employment opportunities in the country for them. And in order for them to make really, really good cash, many of these people, they would join the business of illegally drilling crude oil. In many cases, they will bribe the security guards in the middle of the night, and they will steal the crude oil from big companies like Shell. They will unplug their pipeline in the middle of the night, and they will fill up their ship with barrels and barrels and barrels of crude oil. These oils, they will go through a refining process, and they will be sold onto the market. So the reason why this business is so popular is because these people who are engaging in these illegal activities, on average, they will make anywhere between 3 to 4 times more than the average Nigerian worker. And there's so much demand across Nigeria for these kind of oil because on average they're anywhere between, let's say, 25% to 50% cheaper versus, let's say, going to a Shell gas station. And the government doesn't really do anything about these illegals because once again, this is 25% of the country's GDP, and so many people are doing it. So it's almost impossible to regulate it. And also these people, they have bills to pay, they have families to feed. If the government cannot provide any jobs for them, what the hell are you going to do, right? So this has been allowed to continue to happen. Once again, I maintain a neutral stance. I don't think Shell is a great company by any means. There's a lot of controversies surrounding Shell. They're probably even worse than these Nigerian illegals. But here's my main point. The reason why the Nigerian crude oil is so popular is because I'm sure if you guys look up the country with the largest oil reserve in the world, it's not Nigeria, it's not even Russia or Saudi Arabia, it's not even Canada. Right? Many people think it's in Alberta, but it's actually Venezuela. But however, the crude oil in Venezuela is extremely rough and it's just very unrefined, and it's very, very difficult to extract pure gasoline from the oil in Venezuela. However, the crude oil in Nigeria is very, very pure. So roughly 50% of the crude oil that's being extracted from Nigeria, so 50% of it, half of it, that can be turned into gasoline, and that's ready to fuel your vehicle literally within the course of a couple days. And so this 50% ratio, this is what makes the Nigerian crude oil so attractive. But the refining process, if you guys think I'm making this up, there's so many documentaries, right? You guys can watch where basically these cameramen, they follow these people, and you can actually watch the entire process of how the oil is being stolen, let's say from Shell, or how they're being extracted. And you can watch the entire refining process to turn that crude oil into gas that can be used for everyday vehicles. But this process is extremely dangerous because when the oil is being refined, sometimes just the slightest bit of spark, right? Someone could be lighting a cigarette and the tank would explode. Let's say all 10 people who are working on the site, they could die instantly in the explosion. So it is very normal for people to die on their job site. Also, obviously, it's extremely toxic. So generally, the people who are doing this, the average life expectancy for these people who are extracting this oil and refining the oil, the average life expectancy is roughly 40 years compared to 60 years across Nigeria. So literally your lifespan just by doing this is cut by 20 years. Is this really worth the cost? But once again, this job pays 3 to 4 times more versus the average Nigerian 9-to-5 job. So many people are willing to take on that risk. So this is going to be the #1 crisis for Nigeria for the next few decades. So you have a population explosion. Also, the entire country is dying. No, I'm not talking about, Nigeria is shrinking, right? Because the land area is going to remain the same. But you have to look at the critical factor of arable land. Like how much land in Nigeria is there for you to grow crops? How are you going to feed 400 million Nigerians by 2050? Because this process of extracting and refining the crude oil in Nigeria has completely destroyed the landscape of Nigeria altogether. Because if you look back a few decades earlier, right, the fishing industry used to be booming in Nigeria. However, due to the pollution from this process, the fishing industry has completely died out. Not just this, right, due to the oil and the pollution from this extraction process. So many of the oil, they have sunk deep into the soil, deep into the ground. This means that the entire ecosystem around these extraction sites, they have been completely destroyed. All the animals have left. The trees are no longer there. They have died out. It's impossible for plants and animals to survive. So there's nothing left. And because of this, villages living near these areas, I'm not talking about 1 or 2 villages, I'm talking about hundreds, possibly thousands and tens of thousands of villagers. They have all moved out of their villages, and many of the elders and children, they have been starved to death because back in the day, they could go into the river and catch some fish, or back in the day, they could use their garden to grow some vegetables, but the lands are no longer arable. This is very, very important. You have to remember, there's no way for a country to survive without arable land. How are you going to feed, 230 million Nigerians today? And that's going to go up to 400 million by 2050. And yes, you do have reserves for the next 50 years. But can the country last until 2070? And what's going to happen once the oil runs out? Because at some point you have to realize, yes, you can make as much money as you want. You can become a millionaire. But let's say if you have $1 million cash right in front of you, but when the entire land has died out, when all the birds have flown away, when all the fish have been poisoned, when all the grass, all the trees, all the land have been poisoned, when you can no longer grow rice, when you have nothing to eat, at the end of the day, you can have $1 million sitting in front of you, but you cannot eat your money. And this process, by the way, is not just happening in Nigeria. It can cover many other countries. For example, Congo. And I think what's happening in Congo is probably 5 to 10 times worse versus what's happening in Nigeria. This is very common in many nations around the world, right? At the end of the day, yes, these businesses, they can make you rich. But once again, right, your life expectancy literally goes down by 20 years, right? You could die from an explosion at any moment. And at the end of the day, when the oil is gone, when the land has dried out, you cannot eat your money. This is why it's so important to respect our nature, to respect everything around us, to respect our ecosystem, right? And if you don't think countries like they mentioned, like India, like Pakistan, like Bangladesh, if you don't think they're absolutely filthy, I want you guys to look up some documentaries, right? You can watch full 1-hour documentaries. Look at what the Indians are doing to the Yamuna. The Yamuna and also the Ganges Delta, right? They're considered to be two of the holiest rivers in India. That's like their god, their almighty deity. If those two rivers are holy, right, the Yamuna and the Ganges Delta, how could you guys be doing those things to your rivers, right? How can you guys just be urinating and defecating in those rivers? How can you guys be dumping all of your waste, all of your plastic, all of your used up oil into those rivers? Once the Yamuna and the Ganges Delta dies out, that is going to be the death for India, for Pakistan, and for Bangladesh. You guys have heard me rant for a while about this topic. So do you guys think there's a solution? Well, honestly, there's no easy solution to this, right? Once again, I don't want to support Shell, right? If you actually ban this business, that means that companies like Shell, like Exxon, they're going to completely take over this business. And whatever practice these big companies are doing is probably worse than what the average Nigerian citizen is doing. So this is a very difficult situation. But one thing I will have to say is that, so if you look at the population explosion, right? What's happening in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, right? And also in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa. At some point, I think a drastic measure has to be taken into place. Because what's happening is that, if you guys have seen many documentaries coming out of India, is that, in India, the birth rate is dropping too. But however, if you guys have noticed, it's usually the rich people who are having few children. It's very normal for a rich Indian couple to have just 1 or 2 children. But when you go to the hood, when you go to the ghetto, when you go to the slum, it's very normal for these people who are living in extreme poverty to have 5, 6, 7, 8, or even 10 children. And you see a very similar pattern in Nigeria. Many of the wealthy Nigerians, it's normal for them to just have 1 or 2 kids. But however, the Nigerians who are extremely poor, who are at the bottom 10%, they all end up having 5, 6, 7, 8 children. It's a massive crisis, and the government has to come up with a way to regulate this, because at some point, the earth can only handle so many people. Yes, we're going through a population collapse, but that's in the developed world. But in many countries worldwide, like India, they're still going through a population explosion. Where are these people going to live? How are you going to feed these people? And how are these people going to get access to education? How is the government going to be able to create another 300 million, 400 million, 500 million jobs for these people? There's a massive crisis. Yes, I understand you guys might think the policies of the Chinese Communist Party might be extreme, but honestly, I think countries like Nigeria, countries like India, like Pakistan and Bangladesh, they need to implement a draconian policy. Possibly you have to go with a 2-child policy, or possibly even a 1-child policy, and has to stay in place for at least 20 years in order to slow down the curve of the population explosion. Because what are these people going to do, right? If Nigeria's population goes up by 170 million in the next 26 years, right? If the government cannot find jobs for these people, well, then their number one option is to basically work on these illegal oil extraction sites. Yes, it doesn't matter which side you're on. It doesn't matter if you're liberal, conservative. It doesn't matter if you're Labor or Tory. It doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican. The world is just going to a downward spiral. Everything around us is going to shit, right? In the developed part of the world, you have a population collapse. And in third world countries, you have a population explosion. There's no easy solution out of this.
Everybody knows that I'm breaking down. Everybody knows I ain't faking now. Everybody knows my heart's faking now.